Thank you, Mackenzie, and welcome everyone to today's program. I first like to do is introduce Dr. Emenheiser. Joe Emenheiser joined UConn in the fall of 2020 as an assistant extension educator with a joint position between extension at 75% and animal science at 25%. Joe's area of specialization is livestock production, breeding and genetics, and meat quality improvement. And Joe came to us from UVM. So first of all, Joe, welcome to UConn, and looking forward to your presentation today. Today, Joe will present important information on dairy, on beef and dairy crossbreeding. So without further ado, Dr. Emenheiser.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And one thing I definitely want to do before we go forward is to acknowledge our funders today. So the webinar here today is made possible in part by the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education Fund and USDA NIFA. And so we really appreciate their support and the opportunity to be here. This is an exciting topic, and I'm glad to take a stab at it, but I also want to emphasize that this is a new topic, and it should be an ongoing discussion, and hopefully can create some dialogue here at the end. I was on an Extension Council meeting last night, and the comment was made. I just lost my slide advancer again.
Hey, Joe, when that happened to me yesterday, I just used my scroll on the mouse and scrolled down.
There we go. All right, we're just going to do that. So I was on an Extension Council meeting last night, and the comment was made that this isn't new material. I was making beef dairy crosses 50 years ago, and I had to laugh at that. And so I decided to go back in history and pull up a slide from 50 years ago when John F. Kennedy, who was then senator, made a comment or made a speech about the new frontiers that would put a man on the moon and get a lot of Americans to vote for him for president, which ended up being successful. The irony is that even though this topic has been discussed before and has been practiced before, we are in a new realm in terms of animal breeding, in terms of animal nutrition. And so the concepts that we're going to be talking about today are far more advanced and consequently bring a lot of new material and unanswered questions to the table. Another thing that I want to clarify, in terms of our title slide, is the use of the term beef x dairy. In breeding and genetics, it's common nomenclature for the sire to be listed first, sexist as that is. But beef x dairy is the proper nomenclature. Dairy x beef would be the reverse, and not to be confused with dairy beef, which implies beef that comes from straight dairy-bred cattle, and that accounts for close to 20% of our national beef supply is dairy beef. And the last thing to clarify is what a livestock extension educator means. And the one thing I will say here is that I am not, and I don't pretend to be, a dairy specialist by any means. I have my area of expertise in meat livestock production and meat quality evaluation and improvement, and breeding and genetics, and so I'm going to be presenting a number of these topics from that angle. I know that we have some dairy producers in the audience, and that's great. And one of the things that is going to be important about not only this webinar, but the grant work that I'm going to lay out is that we meet in the middle and work to develop a full system that really incorporates all the links in the production chain. And so, as was laid out in the flyer, just some introduction or groundwork for the topic. because of volatility in fluid milk prices and increased availability of sex semen, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but for now, just take my word for it. Many dairy producers are able to satisfy their need for replacement heifers with fewer purebred matings. And by purebred matings, I mean inseminations, be they natural or artificial, to a dairy breed of the same breed. And that phenomenon leads to the situation that we're in now, where crossbreeding lower performing dairy cows to beef bulls offers an opportunity for dairy producers to diversify their markets and increase revenue in this market situation that we're in, given the advances in technology that have got us to this point. Okay. However, we still have a lot to learn about genetic selection of beef bulls for crossbreeding, which breeds to use on which breeds, which individuals to use, which specific traits to focus on in different production systems. Feeding protocols for those crossbred calves. They're not genetically beef calves. They're not genetically dairy heifers. We can't feed them like one or the other and expect them to perform fully for their genetic merit. Other management strategies that factor in terms of weaning ages or just general strategies. The beef world and the dairy world are very different, and so if a calf is born into a dairy system, it needs to be managed in a dairy system generally, unlike a beef calf that is with its mama and open range generally. And so we have to find that happy medium that matches the genotypes of these animals to allow them to express their genetic potential and ensure a high quality, profitable meat product at the end. And this is where I really come in terms of my focus, in terms of the charge of my position, which has two overarching goals. And one is economic development for the livestock industry, and the other is meat quality improvement. Now, that's not restricted to species, and it doesn't mean that we can't work with dairy producers when there's a meat product being produced. And so certainly there's a big opportunity for this right here, right now. Today, there's three things that I want to cover. Number one, just provide some general information on beef dairy crossbreeding, give a snapshot of the industry. Some of this is probably review for many of you, but I also think it's important that we approach it from this context to make sure that we're all on the same page, because we're going to be trying to form a number of alliances and partnerships with producers, with various other stakeholders moving forward. I want to then provide some insight on the research that's developing here at UConn and with our regional partners in the Northeast states. And then finally, leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay, so this probably doesn't require a slide. Those of you that are intimately involved with the dairy industry are familiar and even more familiar than I am with the volatility in fluid milk prices and the economic challenges that arise when milk prices don't exceed the cost of production. And that has been a situation for a number of years, off and on, up and down. But at the end of the day, there's been volatility. And so when there's a situation of volatility, the way to adapt to that volatility is, one strategy is to diversify the products, to diversify the markets, and to try to have more options to weather out the storm. In this specific context, producing beef ex dairy calves, that that provide a milk product, or sorry, that provide a meat product in addition to fluid milk, is a diversification strategy. The other situation that I described to you, and we're not going to go into great detail with this, but sexed semen. And in real simple terms, the science of this is that the X sperm, the female chromosome sperm, contain more DNA because the X chromosome is larger. And then with the use of a fluorescent dye and electric charges, they can be sorted into male and female sperm. Obviously, for a dairy situation and pure dairy calves, heifer calves are more applicable to that system because they've been bred for female sex limited traits for a number of years, for many decades for that matter, to the point that the bull calves or straight dairy bull calves are essentially a byproduct and don't have a lot of value. So the use of sex semen, generally reports indicate success in excess of 90% in terms of accuracy of that sexing, and that certainly provides an opportunity potentially to produce the same number of heifer calves with half the number of inseminations, in rough terms. Okay, so how does this translate into a breeding program or a selection system? And everything boils down to the necessary replacement rate for heifers. Typically, a replacement rate of 30 to 40% is average in the dairy system, but that's going to depend on a lot of goals and specific aspects of that operation. Longevity, the number of years or lactations that a cow is in the system, and essentially her average age when she produces her first offspring is going to indicate the generation interval. The goals for herd expansion or contraction for that matter. And one of the things that adds some added tension to the price volatility, and this gets into some economics that are above the scope of this presentation. But when milk prices are low, beef prices tend to be antagonistic, tend to be high at a certain point, but there's also a possibility that the market can be flooded with cull dairy cows or with excess dairy calves, and so those two play off of each other in a lot of complex ways. The long and short of that is that the goals for expanding or contracting the herd numbers are going to obviously dictate the necessary replacement rate. And then finally are the genetic goals for the herd. And if a herd is making genetic progress, in theory, the youngest animals are going to be genetically superior. That's not always the case, but we hope that it is. And so when we think about making genetic change over time, the equation is relatively straightforward, but two major factors that are listed here that are going to affect that genetic rate of change are the longevity or the generation interval of the animals, and also the selection differential, how many or how few of the animals that are born are kept as replacements. The more intense that selection, the fewer that are kept relative to the total population, the more genetic change is going to be made. And all of those things work together to determine in genetic terms, which are the best cows in the operation and which are the poorest. Now, obviously, there's a number of complex factors that are going to influence profitability in a dairy operation, and it's not simply just genetics for milk production. If the cow is not able to reproduce effectively, get bred as quickly, or is subject to metabolic disorders, so on and so forth. So there's an index of multiple traits that need to be weighted, but whatever that weighting is for a particular herd or a particular market or program, there's going to be a distribution within the herd of the best cows and the poorest cows, and in the middle, the average ones. And if you're familiar with statistics, that will generally be arranged as a bell curve, particularly if the population is large. So those lower performing cows, those that are genetically average or below, are a prime opportunity in a situation like this to be used to make something other than replacement animals, because genetically they're not going to move the herd forward. And if they're not needed to make those replacements, because sex semen avails the opportunity to make half as many inseminations and still get the same number of heifers, then there's a real opportunity to sort out those bottom cows, right? So this is international data, but I'm hoping that the visuals can shed some more light on the trends here and make it even more clear. These data are from the UK, and just a description of the relative shares of calves born across that population. So the things that should be visible here are that the number of purebred dairy bull calves in gray at the top is decreasing in the last 8 years. The orange block, the share of dairy heifers born from sex semen, is increasing, and consequence of those two things, the yellow blocks, the dairy heifers from conventional semen or unsexed semen, are decreasing. Beef cross is taking more and more of the market share from those lower performing heifers or lower performing cows, to the extent that the overall percentage of calves born in these data is nearly 50% beef cross. Now, we're not there quite yet in the US, but we very well could be. And I think that we have a number of these situations that we need to consider in order to be prepared for that. These data are from Canada, and before you allow the legends here to mislead you, the blue dashed line is on a different axis than the red line. There are not more beef breed services than there are Holstein sires, but the beef breed services has certainly been increasing exponentially, whereas the number of purebred Holstein matings has decreased nearly as a mirror image, and the other dairy breed sires, in other words, dairy crossbreeding, which was maybe a little bit more vocal or discussed 20 years ago, really hasn't moved the needle much at all and stayed pretty static and pretty low. Okay, so in terms of population genetics, the concept is really simple here, and the bottom line is that the best animals are above average and the worst are below, and the majority of them will be in the middle. If you focus your selection for replacements on the animals that are highlighted in blue, you will over time be able to move the entire bell curve to the right in the desired direction in terms of genetic ranking. And so those cows that fit into that category are the prime candidates for sex semen to produce heifers to continue to move forward. But that avails easily 50%. And sometimes if things are really dialed in, the needed replacement rate is not very high, longevity is higher, and so on and so forth. There could be up to 70, 75% of the cow herd that's not needed to generate replacement. That's highlighted in white. Okay, that could be used for conventional semen or an opportunity for beef semen to make crossbreds. Okay, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the mechanics of crossbreeding and some of the underlying molecular definitions there. Without going too far in the weeds, the simple points to be made here are that the most powerful tool in animal breeding is hybrid vigor. We can select our way into success for many traits. Holsteins and milk production are one of them. Where in general a Holstein is superior for fluid milk volume than any crossbred. However, that's not typically the case, and that's not going to be the case with many of the performance traits that we're going to talk about on the beef side. The other point to be made is that the simple definition of heterosis or hybrid vigor is the difference in the performance of an animal from the average of its parents. So if we look at these bars on the chart here, breed 1, breed 2, they could be dairy and beef or dairy, beef and beef. It doesn't matter. Let's say they're unrelated breeds. Okay. The average of the blue and the red bars is the green bar. But more often than not, the crossbred offspring performs greater than the average, and that purple portion, which is the difference between performance and the average, is the heterosis value or the hybrid vigor value. Okay. Now, before we get too excited about hybrid vigor and meat quality, I want to talk about some of these traits because I do find a lot of misunderstanding about this generally across species. And the bottom line is that different traits have different heritabilities, and consequently they have different responses to heterosis. And most commonly, the traits that are more heritable have a lower response to heterosis. It's the traits that are lowly heritable that really respond to heterosis. So those traits that are lowly heritable are the reproduction traits, survival traits, and to some extent the maternal traits. And their heritability, meaning the percentage of the phenotypic variation that's attributable just to genetics that can be passed from one generation to the next, is very low, 5 to 10% typically. Okay? But the response to heterosis, that purple portion where an animal performs greater than the average of its parents, is generally around 20%. And that's, if we think about that in terms of bank account, that's a pretty good return, particularly if the input costs aren't any greater. However, when we get into the product traits, loin eye size, back fat thickness, dressing percentage, marbling, and so forth, the heritability is high, but the heterosis response is basically nil. So in that sense, the product traits are more driven by selection than they are crossbreeding. Okay, so that's why it becomes very important that we have tools to develop and select beef sires for product traits that can contribute additive genetics and make calves that are superior for those highly heritable traits. Now, generally, we're not going to be keeping these crossbred calves for reproduction. And so some of the main advantages of heterosis are, are lost in that system, but there is going to be a boost in growth traits, which are moderately heritable. And the bottom line is that a crossbred beef dairy calf is going to certainly outperform a pure dairy calf in terms of growth and also feed efficiency and some other traits. Okay. To me, it's important to start from the standpoint of products and markets with this. And if we're going to venture into producing a new and different meat product, we need to make sure that it is high quality, that it's consistent, and that ultimately it's profitable for everybody involved in the chain from conception to consumption. Because if it's not those things, it's not going to be sustainable no matter how many buzzwords and grant dollars we throw at it. So from the beef world, there is a long developed system of grading by the USDA. Now, there's not much USDA grading presence here in the Northeast, but the concepts still hold true in terms of relating the attributes of the animal and the carcass and the product to its quality and yield. Okay, so whether we think about this in terms of grade or we think about it just in terms of concepts, quality and yield are both important. Quality grade covers the aspects of palatability or taste. And generally that's broken into three categories: tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. Now, the main drivers of tenderness, juiciness, and flavor, beyond cookery and some of the things that we can do to mess up a good product, are maturity or the age of the animal. Pretty key and well documented over the time or over the years that a major driver of meat tenderness is age. As an animal gets older, its meat is less tender, pretty much, period. And marbling, which is intramuscular fat or fat within the muscle, is a big driver of juiciness and also of flavor. Much of the flavor that's associated with any beef product comes from the fat and the fatty acids that are manifested there more so than the lean. And so, without getting into the nitty-gritty of quality grading, let's just say that that's estimated of aspects of maturity or age and marbling. Okay, yield grade is an estimate not of the palatability of the product, but of its cutout value, and that's measured as the percentage of closely trimmed retail cuts. Now, there's some things that drive that, and the three tissues of importance are muscle, fat, and bone. The percentage of closely trimmed retail cuts is going to increase as fat decreases. The percentage is going to increase as muscle increases, and the percentage of closely trimmed retail cuts is going to slightly decrease as bone increases. But many of those retail cuts are boneless anyway, so the composition of bone is less important. One point that I would like to make here is that yield grade, or the percentage of closely trimmed retail cuts, is not the same as dressing percentage. Dressing percentage is hot carcass weight divided by live weight. It's a good measure of a lot of things, and it's often used to determine value or pricing in a lot of our markets around here, for multiple species for that matter. But dressing percentage reflects everything that's on a carcass, not on closely trimmed retail cuts. And so a very fat animal can have a high dressing percentage, but a low percentage of retail cuts after the trimming is done. So I just want to make the point from a carcass standpoint, knowing that we have a mostly dairy audience here, to not get caught up or overvalue dressing percentage in terms of composition. The traits that factor into assessing yield grade include back fat thickness, which is a pretty good indicator of the total fat in the carcass, and that's measured over the ribeye between the 12th and 13th ribs. Internal fat, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, the ribeye area, and the carcass weight. And those two things are evaluated relative to each other, where the heavier carcass is, the larger its ribeye is expected to be. Now, I'd like to make a point before we go too much further, to take a look at these pictures on the right, and that describes with ribeyes, which most of you are familiar with as a beef cut, I would presume, one of the key differences between beef type and dairy type carcasses, muscles, and cuts. And beef type ribeyes are generally larger muscled, but more specifically, they're a deeper, more symmetrical muscle, where dairy type tends to be more oval shaped, shallower, and flatter, less symmetrical. It doesn't necessarily mean that that the ribeye is smaller, because many times the carcass is large to be able to get to the same degree of fatness. Okay, but the shape is going to be different, and that consideration has made its way into a lot of branded beef programs like Certified Angus Beef, where carcasses are discounted or not eligible for that brand if they exhibit dairy type. So it should compute now, or it should be a memorable thing, that one of the challenges to producing a quote unquote quality meat product that yields well is overcoming some of the differences in muscle shape between beef and dairy. Now, when it comes to quality grade, interestingly, dairy breeds tend to marble pretty well. And so even though the percentage of external fat or surface fat is relatively less, the intramuscular fat is usually higher. Okay, that's a good thing in terms of quality grade. Okay, but the challenge with dairy beef many times is on the maturity side, and to get a dairy bred animal to an acceptable degree of finish and marbling requires considerably longer time than for most beef animals. And so by that time they're older, and there will generally be some challenges with tenderness and potentially stronger flavors. Okay, those are product attributes, and those are important, but it also, to produce a profitable meat product, requires production efficiency. And that's every step along the chain, but including things like average daily gain, how quickly can they get there, and what's their age going to be when they're done, feed conversion, and ultimately the income to expense ratio. Is this venture profitable? Okay, this is a slide that I use in a production and livestock and carcass evaluation class. Obviously, both of these animals are beef, and Steve will probably cringe at my oversimplification of growth and composition here on this slide. But the long and short of it is that different typed animals, even within the beef breeds, have different growth curves. Animals go through basically 3 phases of tissue deposition, frame being first, muscle being second, and fat being third. For a Holstein, that frame sector is longer, reaches a higher percentage of the body weight before muscle deposition, which really is not a lot in the dairy animal. And then regardless of animal, and certainly with beef, and especially with beef that are earlier maturing, smaller framed, the fat phase can increase exponentially once it gets to that point. Okay, so the whole theory of producing a quality product comes down to harvesting these animals at the appropriate point in their growth curve. And the black line here shows a point where the relative percentages of muscle, fat, and bone are appropriate for optimizing quality grade, yield grade, and feed efficiency or production efficiency. And we could get into that farther, but I want to keep moving here. When we're talking about feed efficiency, the longer we keep an animal, we're going to increase or going to experience a decreased rate of gain on an average daily gain basis, and also a decrease in feed efficiency, meaning it will take more pounds of feed to produce a pound of live weight. Okay, so there are pure dairy animals that can produce great beef, and the animal on the left is one that checks a lot of boxes in terms of beef quality and yield. Obviously a Holstein, but just over 1,400 pounds, 61.5% dressing percentage, computes to an 870-pound carcass. That's about where we want him to be. He's a yield grade 3, high choice, acceptable muscle to bone ratio. He's clearly a Holstein, but he can run right there with some of the better beef animals. I've certainly seen a lot of beef animals that don't check those boxes. But on the other side of that, we have to recognize that dairy animals are not bred to produce meat quality. And so on the right, we've got the Guinness Book of World Records tallest steer in the world. And the Holstein, we get more frame on them. They're going to be later maturing. They're going to have to reach pretty heavy weights to get acceptable fatness, both externally and intramuscularly. That's going to affect their feed efficiency, and that's going to affect their production economics. Okay, so that's all product focused. That's great. But what about before that? And I mentioned we've got 3 considerations, or 4. Genetic selection of bulls for crossbreeding, feeding protocols for those calves, other management strategies that factor in, and then the economics. Is it going to be profitable? Okay. There's a lot of things that we could dig into with the genetic selection. With training as a geneticist, I would love to do this, and we're going to reserve that for later webinars that come with the outreach that I'm going to talk about here shortly. There are other universities that are more equipped for feeding cattle, Penn State being one of the closest, that are deeply involved in genetic selection studies for beef dairy crossbreeding, comparing breeds, comparing specific sires. Okay, there are indexes, genetic indexes, that are being specifically developed for crossbreeding, for selecting a beef animal to breed to dairy cows. The traits of primary importance there, the 2 that there's no exception to, is conception and calving ease. The carcass traits, the 3rd C, is going to factor in differently depending on the breed that the bull is being bred to. Holsteins need generally less frame, earlier maturity. Jerseys generally need a little bit more performance. Both need muscle, and both need marbling genetics to some extent, but that depends on the markets. The breed associations are working on the crossbreeding indexes. The Angus has their $AXH and AXJ values for selecting bulls to breed to Holsteins or Jerseys, respectively. The Simmental Association has a terminal index, which emphasizes those traits above, and some others. The semen companies are also developing their genetic indexes. And everybody's going to try to market their own index, and there's a lot of minutia that we could dig into there that we won't, but there are tools that are becoming available that are highly complex and cater to specific scenarios for genetic selection. And from an industry standpoint, even though this is happening more widely and has happened longer internationally, in the US beef industry, we're still trying to get a handle on some of the benchmarking of performance data and carcass data. Okay. One of the things that becomes focal here is the impact of early management on the rest of the life of the animal. And unlike a beef animal, like I said, that's raised by its mother, generally, calves from dairy cows are raised artificially. And so that early artificial management can have a huge bearing on the rest of the life. A lot of management can boil down to nutrition, and that's a major source of variation there. And so there's some interesting questions in terms of the impact of nutrition on growth potential, on economic returns, and ultimately on the suitability for a market, the product quality. As it turns out, that's we felt a key hypothesis for a grant proposal that we wrote to the Northeast SARE, Novel Approaches Funding, and essentially our question was centered around those three things: nutritional management strategies for improving growth, carcass composition, and economic returns of beef dairy crossbred calves. There are four colleagues of mine from UConn, the three in the animal science department, Sarah Reed, Kristen Gavoni, and Steve Zinn, and myself representing both animal science and extension. And then from Penn State Extension, the beef specialist Tara Felix gives us some multi-state representation, allows this grant to tie into some survey access and also some carcass data access, and product-focused endpoint stuff that we wouldn't have access to here. Okay, so very quickly, our experimental design, breeding Holstein cows to beef semen, making 40 beef dairy calves, crossbred calves. We're going to evaluate two different milk replacer protocols, a control that's 26% fat, 20% protein, and a high quality milk producer or milk replacer, certainly more expensive, but 32% fat, 30% protein. Calves will be weaned at 56 days of age, transitioned to two rations, one of which is a 14% protein calf grower, and the other an isonitrogenous corn silage-based TMR, targeting an average daily gain of 3 pounds a day for both groups. And they will be fed those things and transition to a finishing ration, which more than likely will not occur here, but likely in Pennsylvania with proximity to the packing plant at about 500 pounds through market weight. Okay. We'll be evaluating data on the factors that I described: growth and composition, taking body weights, linear measurements, crown, rump length, hip height, those kinds of things. We also have the ability and technology here to measure feed intake, which will make this particularly valuable and particularly novel in the literature. I have expertise and equipment to evaluate carcass traits with ultrasound, which allows us to evaluate them serially throughout growth, and take carcass traits like back fat thickness and ribeye area and marbling. We'll also be doing some muscle biopsies, fiber numbers, cross-sectional areas, and also intramuscular fat content. Then, after the finishing phase, the cattle will be harvested and we'll collect carcass data, including all those same things to validate them, but also quality and yield grade indicators, in addition to carcass weights. Okay, that will then give us the opportunity to do cost benefit analysis, where we've tracked our production costs. We've got sale values that include grid prices off of a quality yield-based carcass pricing grid. And the third component of this SARE project, which we were fortunate to have funded for $200,000 plus some additional hatch funds that Steve Zinn and I were able to solicit, which will give us the opportunity to get a graduate student and make this a larger project. We'll be teaming up with the Penn State Center for Survey Research, surveying 10,000 dairies in the Northeast United States. A whole lot more complex questions than are listed here, but essentially quantifying the number of beef dairy crossbred calves that are produced, the current practices and decision-making strategies that factor in, and also what information and support is needed for success. And when we get that information from the producers and we can form partnerships and alliances, then I and colleagues in Pennsylvania and potentially other states long term can develop appropriate extension and outreach strategies to help producers make this industry viable, profitable for them, and ultimately producing a quality product. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I appreciate your time, and I have included my contact information here. If you have any questions about the project, if you have any thoughts or ideas to share, or if you simply just like to be informed as the project moves forward, please contact me. Email tends to be best, but I welcome any inquiries there. Thank you to our sponsors again, and with that, I'll open it up for any questions or discussion that you may have.
So I don't see any questions in the chat, but like I said earlier, I mean, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions you have or provide like comments or feedback. More than welcome.
I have a question, Joe, if I could. As the grant and and although when it does begin, will there be information posted on websites or in terms of how the information is progressing, what data would be available in terms of outreach of information?
Yes, absolutely. That will be a key part of the extension component. So the livestock extension website at UConn is undergoing a pretty major overhaul right now, but the goal is to create a space for this grant specifically, and I'll keep that updated.
Has the grant begun, Joe? Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's been awarded, but the funds have not quite been received. But we started breeding cows in anticipation. So we've got things got cooking, and we'll be rolling here soon.
Just curious too, Joe, if I could ask, are some of the animals here, or are they split between here and Penn State?
All of the animals, all the cows are here. All the calves will be here for the initial, trial through at least 500 pounds. We haven't exactly worked out the finishing protocols of the where and when yet. I anticipate that a lot of that will be in Pennsylvania, but after 500 pounds. So we'll do all the feeding trials, all of the, early serial scanning and biopsies and those kinds of things here. Then I'll continue to go down to Pennsylvania and scan, and I'll ultimately make a trip and collect carcass data. It's thankfully not that far away.
Sounds like great research, Joe. Congratulations on the grant that you were awarded and others awarded, and I'm sure all of our dairy farmers here in Connecticut, as well as the Northeast and beyond, are going to look forward to your research results as well too. So. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
For all the work that you're doing. Any other questions for Dr. Emenheiser?
This is the most quiet I've ever seen Bill Davenport.
Well, we got some welcome rain today too. I know we want to be out there doing things outside, but quite frankly, this is welcome rain for the middle of April that was already getting a little bit dry. So it's a good thing that we're getting rain. Now, we don't need snow in the northwest portion, right, Bill? But we need the rain.
Yeah, we're good without snow.
Right, right. Any closing thoughts, Mackenzie? Any closing ideas or thoughts or?
No, like Joe said, I mean, feel free to reach out to him via email. And also just a reminder, we did record this today. So in case you weren't able to see it all or want to share it with somebody, we will have a link available probably by Monday for everybody to share with anybody else that they think would benefit from watching this webinar. So we thank you for joining us.
Yep. And I just have one real quick idea I had. I don't know if there's any chance that 4-H kids could be involved with any kind of part of this, just so they can kind of learn about it and understand that, you know, there are grants and research out there that can possibly affect them in their futures, you know, once they get into all this too. So I guess keep that in mind, that if you need an army of kids that can, I don't know what, at least connect with some dairy farmers and get their opinions, or they could even do a little, you know, junior study of some kind of survey they can come up with. It'd be cool to involve dairy and beef 4-H kids in our state. They could maybe reach out to Penn State kids too. I don't know. Just thinking that I'd love to have that filter down into the you know, high school age kids who are going to end up hopefully at UConn, and I don't know. It'd be kind of cool to include them. So whatever you think could happen, keep me posted, and I'd be glad to help spearhead that part of it.
Great. No, thank you. I think there's a real opportunity to bridge some of the commodity groups here, and also bridge some of the age groups, you know, which tend to not always interact, you know, to the extent that they can. So, you know, I'm more than happy to do ultrasound demonstrations or just come give a presentation, you know, on the findings that we're doing, or involve kids in surveying or whatever we need to do. I think that'd be great.
Yep. Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah, I could definitely see something like this happening at the Connecticut Dairy and Beef Day, if that ever, when that does occur in person next.
Yeah,
Thing showing
that's what
some
I'm
of the
thinking of that.
research and stuff, it'd be great.
Yep.
Okay, well, if there's no other further or comments or thoughts, I want to thank Joe, Dr. Emenheiser, very much for his presentation today. Again, welcome to UConn, Joe, you and your family to the area, and we're looking forward to your research results, as well as you're going to be doing for Connecticut agriculture as well too. So if there's no other comments or thoughts or ideas, again, stay safe, everybody. Enjoy the spring. Hopefully get sufficient rain for all of our crops and our livestock. And thank you, Mackenzie,